Hi all. First of all, thank you for joining. My name is Laura Gerritsen from the Solidaridad Europe team, Europe Gold team here, speaking from the Netherlands, from Utrecht. Thank you for joining the webinar. We today have the 5th webinar of a series, what we call the Golden Myths, really looking at facts around small scale ASM gold mining. Today, especially, we're going to look at the super exciting topic of access to formal finance and the needs and opportunities for that of small scale gold miners. I'm going to wait for a minute to allow people to join, and then we'll start introducing our expert panelists to you, which we have on the call today. Maybe in the meantime, just some practicalities. In the less exciting things, but in the screen, you'll see a Q&A button. During the panel, you can write down your questions there and we'll assemble all the questions for after the panel, so that hopefully we can address most of your questions there. Please do keep it to the topic related to today's webinar. So to ASM gold mining. There's also a chat function. So if there is anything technical, if Zoom doesn't work, please type in the chat function. Then my colleagues, who you cannot see but are here to support the tech side of the webinar, can help you either get back into Zoom or whatever the problem is. They will try to solve that for you. Just giving it another 1 minute for people to join, and then I think we are ready to start. Oh, and also if you put a question in the Q&A, it would be very nice if you also list your name and company or organization you work for, to be able to address your question. But if you want to do it anonymously, that's of course also allowed. But that would be nice. Okay, so today we are joined by 5 experts that will talk a bit more about access to finance for small-scale gold miners. So I would like to start introducing Louis to you all, Louis Maréchal, for who doesn't know Louis. Hi, Louis. Louis has over 10 years experience in the mining field on different issues of mining. First from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of France, and the last 6-7 years at the OECD, really looking at dialogue with with companies and governments, as well as civil society stakeholders, on how to drive more responsibility in gold supply chains, among others. So Louis will share a bit about the OECD's and his perspective on responsibility in gold supply chains and access to finance. Secondly, we're joined by Susan Keane, director at the NRDC, the International Program for Natural Resources Defense Council. Super welcome, Susan. She has over 30 years of experience in international environmental health issues, really focusing on mercury, and has also been active in the establishment of, for example, the Minamata Convention. Now is coordinating Planet Gold, which she will tell a little bit more about, who's recently done a lot of research on access to finance for small-scale gold mining and the barriers around that. Thirdly, we have from the Solidaridad team, Winifrida Kanwa, who is calling in from Tanzania. So hopefully the connection will remain stable. Winnie is a process engineer who has worked more than 10 years in the field, really working hands-on with artisanal gold miners in Tanzania. And we'll actually share a bit more of the local perspective on what the needs and opportunities are in access to finance. Then David Sturmes will be our almost last speaker, Director Program and Operations from the Impact Facility. David has worked over 6 years in value chains assessments and monitoring, establishing monitoring and impact measurement systems in international supply chains, including different mine sites, be it gold mines or gemstone mines in Africa and beyond. So really happy to have you on the call as well, David. He will share a bit more about the work of the impact facility and what the opportunities really are for investment into small-scale gold mining. And then last but not least, we have on the call Ebenezer Arthur, who is the founder and CEO of Bangara Green Ventures, which is an impact capital investment firm that is, amongst others, receiving capital from the World Bank and is investing in climate smart, small, growing enterprises, mainly in Ghana. He will speak a bit from the impact investors' perspective on what you should think about and how different examples of agriculture could be potentially provide lessons learned for the ASM sector. So we have a very full panel, but with really interesting perspectives from different angles. So excited to actually give the floor as the first one to Louis Marichal, who will speak a bit about the OECD. So Louis, great if you can share some of your insights from your work and perspective on the ASM gold mining sector and the need or opportunities for access to finance. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to check, am I sharing my screen or are you displaying the slides?
Displaying the slides. You cannot see the slides at the moment?
Yeah, see, yeah, I can, but not mine. It's on.
Yeah, they're coming. Yes.
Oh, there you go. Great. Thanks a lot. Well, we can go to the next slide already. So yeah, I'm working with the OECD and Center for Responsible Business Conduct. That, amongst other things, has steered the development of a document with a very long title that you don't need to remember, but basically is a document whose objective is really to promote responsible investments in minerals trade and production in conflict-affected and high-risk areas. So this is really supposed to be a tool that will help companies remain engaged in areas that are impacted by conflict and other forms of human rights violation. And how does it do that? It actually provides companies with recommendations on how they can map their supply chain all the way through the production level and conduct risk assessments to understand to what extent, as a company, through their purchasing decisions, they may be connected to conflict financing issues, violations of human rights issues, and serious economic crimes issues. Next slide, please. I don't want to go into too much detail. The couple of things that are important. It applies to all mineral resources and all companies through the mineral supply chain. But for historical reasons, our work really started focusing on gold, tin, tantalum, and tungsten. So we have about a decade of experience working on due diligence in gold supply chains. Again, these are recommendations that apply for companies all throughout, so from the mining entity to the end consumer. One key principle of our work is that we only expect progressive improvements. We don't expect full transparency in gold supply chains from one day to the next, because we know how complex this may be. And we also expect good faith and reasonable efforts to actually build that transparency, meaning that we are also aware that sometimes the obstacles are too great to actually establish transparency, and that we should not be expecting the world out of sometimes small and medium companies that don't really have the means to collect the appropriate information. Other very important points to just clarify sometimes misconceptions. Our work is global in scope. We don't target any specific region in the world. As you may know, a US piece of legislation in 2010 was based on our guidance, but targeting the Great Lakes regions of Africa specifically. We don't do that. And as you will see later on in the presentation, we are working, of course, in the GLR, but also in West Africa and in Colombia for producing regions. So again, I repeat, our work is not about blacklisting, embargoing, or setting protectionist measures. It's exactly the opposite. we're trying to work as hard as we can to help companies remain engaged in conflict affected and high risk areas. So that's why we call this guidance a de-risking tool for investors, because basically, as from an investor perspective, this document entails recommendations on the steps that investors may be willing to take to collect information and conduct their own risk assessments when they're considering a specific investment in the gold supply chain. Next, please. That's a snapshot of the global implementation of the guidance. It needs to be updated, but basically you'll see states in red are African states that have endorsed our guidance. In the Congo, it's actually part of the mining regulation, and in Rwanda as well. We're also, as I said, working now in West Africa, increasingly in Colombia, but we're also working with processing and consuming countries. So I don't have time to expand too much on that, but we're making significant progress lately in India, where the gold industry has taken commitments to foster transparency in their own sourcing practices. Next slide, please. Of course, sorry, just to say, the European Union, as you may know, has adopted a regulation on so-called conflict minerals, which is a terminology that we do not use, but this regulation of the EU is actually entirely based on the OECD guidance. A key feature of our standard is that it acknowledges the key contribution of responsible ASGM and what it can bring to markets and societies, both domestically, but also from an international standpoint. And so a lot of our work is trying to find out ways to connect responsible artisanal gold producers to international markets. So in the document itself, we have a specific appendix that provides a roadmap. We call it a roadmap to create economic and development opportunities for artisanal gold miners. And we took this a step further through the development of a frequently asked question type document for international buyers to source artisanal gold. So you can access this document here, and you'll see that it's made of 12 straightforward questions that international buyers may ask themselves when they're looking at sourcing gold from artisanal miners. And we actually developed that product as an additional tool to help buyers engage with informal gold miners. We strongly make the point that all stakeholders should be engaged in legalization and formalization processes throughout the world. And this is a point that we're making constantly. And as Laura mentioned, we are constantly in calls with individual and economic entities like refiners or major international industry associations to really go into the practical options that they may have to source responsibly from artisanal and small-scale miners. So that takes a lot of our work. It's extremely complex, but fascinating work. Next slide, please. Oh, no, that's done. Sorry. I don't know if questions are for now, or otherwise I'd be happy to take them later.
And I have to be unmuted. I would love to ask you some questions after the rest. There's already a question for you in the Q&A, so you can have a look. That will be coming. But great if I can give now. Thanks a lot, Luis. And I think this makes a good bridge to the work of Susan, who basically with Planet Gold is looking at how to indeed formalize and work within different countries with Planet Gold to strengthen ASM mining organizations. So Susan, happy to hear your views and more about Planet Gold.
Great, thank you, Laura. So again, I'm Susan Keene. I work for the Natural Resources Defense Council, which is a US-based environmental NGO. But here today, I'm in my capacity as the coordinator of the global coordinator of the Planet Gold program. The Planet Gold program is funded by the Global Environment Facility as the financial mechanism for the Minamata Convention on Mercury. And our main objective, as you might expect, since we're a part of the Minamata Convention, is to reduce the use of mercury in small-scale gold mining. But the program does that through strengthening the formalization of small-scale gold miners, technology transfer, better equipment, both processing and extraction, and through trying to improve access to finance and formal markets. So next slide, please. Thanks. So before we talk about access to finance, it's good to actually think about who needs financing and what needs financing before you actually then talk about financing. So as probably everyone on this call knows, ASGM is a very diverse sector. It covers everything. That rubric covers everything from really small, individual operators, panners, medium size cooperatives, to fairly mechanized and what I would maybe consider medium scale mining, but is still governed under the rules of small scale mining. So a very diverse sector obviously has very, very diverse financing needs and different objectives of that financing. Next slide, please. So what needs financing? And in particular, if we want to have the endpoint be responsible sourcing and responsible production, so that there can be responsible sourcing. So of course, maybe the first thing that springs to mind that needs financing is equipment. You need extraction equipment, processing equipment, and in the case of Planet Gold, very focused on mercury-free processing equipment. But in addition to this, hardware, this equipment, these mining operations also need software, if you will. That is, training on how to improve occupational health, the social aspects of their operations, the economic and business aspects of their operations. They need help with resource management, prospecting, et cetera. And they need help with complying with the requirements of responsible supply chains. For example, the due diligence requirements that Louis just spoke about. So all of that takes money too, and resources, as well as the actual financing of equipment. Next slide, please. So currently there, as probably again, everyone on this call knows, there is limited access to formal finance. Most small scale mining, gold mining is currently financed informally. And what's the reason for this? So Planet Gold has done some research, including in collaboration with the Impact Facility, on what are the barriers to accessing finance. And you can see those reports on our website if you're interested in the details, but none of these will be a surprise to anyone. The barriers are both from the side of the miners who are trying to access finance, as well as barriers for those trying to provide finance. So in the case of the miners, there are often regulatory hurdles. Many of them are informal. They don't have the legal status that would make them eligible for formal finance. They have some difficulty either meeting the due diligence requirements, or maybe they meet them, but they have trouble documenting or demonstrating that they're in compliance with those requirements. And they don't get the government support they need in terms of this software that I was describing, training and capacity building. Many of them are not business ready. Many are, but many are not business ready. They don't really have the experience with formal finance that will allow them. They don't have the vocabulary to present their business needs in a way, in a language that financial entities would really understand. And where there are already available commercial financial products, many of those products don't really have the elements, or they aren't really tailored to the specific needs of small scale miners. On the side of those providing finance, one of the biggest barriers is headline risk, reputational risk. This sector has, in the minds of the general population, many others, a very bad reputation associated with human rights violations, environmental impacts, etc. Those of us who work in the sector know that that's not the full story, and it's really not fair to paint the entire sector with that brush. But nonetheless, that's from the perspective of people who are interested in finance, that becomes a risk. There are high due diligence costs. If they want to be make sure that they minimize their risks, they need to be able to monitor these operations. And that's quite difficult often in remote areas in different countries. And that incurs a lot of cost. They may just simply have a lack of investable projects. As I said, the miners don't always have the vocabulary to come with projects laid out in a way that the investors know how to evaluate that, know how to evaluate the risks in a way that they're used to doing for other kinds of business opportunities. And finally, especially for investors who might be investing in foreign countries, there are often regulations about foreign investment that create a barrier to investment for those entities. Next slide, please. So, the upshot of that, of all those barriers, is that there really is a lack of access to formal finance. And so Planet Gold, along with many other practitioners in the sector, are trying to think of how to improve access to finance. And this table that you see in front of you is an attempt to really do the first step of that thinking, which is how do we match the needs, the finance needs across the full spectrum of operations to the appropriate sources of finance. So this is not a mapping of what currently exists, but rather a roadmap for the future of how we might try to approach different kinds of financial sources to fill the needs of small-scale miners. So, for example, at the low end, low value end of the scale of, artisanal scale, miners may only need, hundreds to tens of thousands of dollars to meet their needs to support their livelihoods. And if the goal is just livelihood support and poverty elimination, microfinance or village level financing schemes may be sufficient for their needs. At the other end of the spectrum, if we want to create, new centralized processing systems, especially those of us who really are interested in mercury elimination, that kind of investment might be necessary. It's in the hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars. It's more likely that private capital will have to be involved, either equity, debt, or blended finance. Across all of these scales, donor and philanthropic finance can support access by providing both de-risking through blended finance, through supporting things like loan guarantees or other mechanisms, and also helping with, let's call it the architecture, creating different tools and trainings and, business models that can really help miners create business propositions that attract finance. So this is, as I said, a roadmap for the future that we are pursuing. Planet Gold is currently working in 8 countries around the world, and over the next year or so, we'll be expanding to another 8 countries. And we hope to really test out different methods to try to attract finance to the sector. Thank you. That's it. Laura, you have to unmute.
I always do that. Okay, thanks, Susan. It was really insightful to hear more about the work of Planet Gold and the barriers and opportunities in ASM space. I would love to hear now from Winifrida Kanma of Solidaridad, from the more local perspective on what your experience is working with local ASM mines on what is possible and what is needed. So Winnie, love to hear from you. Please go ahead.
Well, thank you, Laura. My name is Winifrida Kanma, as has been introduced by Laura. I work with the Solidaridad, and I'm based in Tanzania as project manager for Gold Project. Next. The real situation in the mines is that the ASM means artisanal and small-scale gold miners do not have formal access to finance, and they rely to be refinanced by local brokers, and this limits their bargaining power towards their produced gold. So due to lack of this access to finance, the mining operations for artisanal and small-scale miners is inefficient, with poor mining equipment, low production levels, and high health risks for workers because they don't have money to invest in purchasing personal protective equipment, but also they have unsafe and high-risk mining because they don't have enough capital to support their mining environment, but also they have high environmental degradation because they don't have funds to invest in environmental conservation. And then they have little or no investment in personal protective equipment, since the small money which they get from production, they prioritize to reinvest in purchasing the operational cost. And also due to this, they look for cheap labor in the mines, so they don't care of the rights of workers, but also sometimes they are forced to go to child labor because children, they cannot bargain, they cannot have the bargaining power for high pay. Yeah, next. Solidaridad have been working with the Impact Facility for a long time. In Eastern Central Africa, we see that together we have supported 24 ASM mines in Tanzania, Kenya, and Uganda. But Solidaridad have been working with ASM miners for a number of years, about 15. It started in South America and then extended the work into West Africa and then East and Central Africa. So Solidaridad does capacity building to artisanal and small-scale mining with the use of ESG screening or escalator, and this is economic, social, and governance escalator, which is focusing more on legal compliance, good governance, financial management, decent work, social responsibility, and environmental stewardship. And this ESG is used to improve the work of the ASM from the basic, intermediate to advanced level. And these levels are aligned with the international standards. For example, the basic level is aligned with OECD due diligence criteria and the craft, and the intermediate is aligned with the Swiss Beta Gold criteria, and the advanced level is aligned with the Fair Trade, Fair Mine certification. So we use the ESG escalator to assess the situation of the mines, and then we support them to improve toward the gaps which have been identified. And with a number of capacity building which is being done is focusing mainly on occupational health, good business practice, environmental management, safe chemical management, and technical trainings. Next, please. So Solidaridad, through building these capacities, we prepare the mines to be ready to receive investment from the impact facility. And the capacity building is being done at the mine site and also through meetings, workshops. Also, we provide support to ASM miners at their mines. So we visit them and we support them towards improvement. Then we work closely with the government to provide support to the miners. And this brings sustainability because the government feels the sense of ownership by being linked directly to these miners. Next. Next slide. Yeah, thank you. So this is an example of So we have the investment needs for ASM miners. They need a lot of equipment for their improvement on safety and health, but also on production. Some of the equipment which have been listed here is the submersible water pump, air compressor, and improved Swiss boxes. For example, supporting them with the water pump, we see that they will be pumping out through underground water throughout as they mine, and this helps them to improve production. They will have high earning, but also this will help to support the shaft walls as this maintain the safety for workers who are working underground. Yeah, and on the intermediate, this is the example of the escalator, how it works. For example, at the basic level, we see that if the mine can avoid the whole ore amalgamation, that they can concentrate the produced ore to small amount of concentrate and then use small amount of gold, of mercury, then we say it has complied with the basic level. And then coming to the intermediate level, that if they can capture mercury by using available technologies. For example, doing amalgamation in the lined ponds so that mercury does not disperse to the environment. Now we say this mine has complied with the intermediate level. And as we have seen that this is linked to the Swiss better gold criteria. But also when coming to the advanced level, that the mine has now been using the mercury reduction techniques or technologies, for example, using retort. If the mine is using this, then we term that the mine has gone to the advanced level and has been complied with the international standards like the fair trade and fair mine. Next. Yeah, I've already explained this, but also apart from the equipment need, also the miners beyond this are seeking for access to working capital to cover operating costs, reliable geological data, and technical capacity building to increase recovery and production. Next. Yeah, so the impact investment is very important for miners. As they receive this investment, they improve production. With the improve in the production, it means they will have higher gold and will have higher income and will improve their life, their families, and the community. And then we'll have funds for investing in safety and health for the workers. For example, purchasing of safety and equipment, but also investing in environmental conservation. And with this, we create the good environment and a good community for people to live in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Winifrida. And on our side, apologies for the slides. We mixed up a bit, so that's why you went back and forth. But thank you very much for highlighting really well a bit more the local perspective. And I see there's some questions that I will ask a bit after the panel to you. Also, I wanted to briefly, before having David go to the presentation of the impact facility, I also briefly wanted to say that we were also joined by Tom Hoyle from Genesis Trust, who also you see on camera. So I thought it was nice to introduce Tom as well, who will briefly also say a note to this part on the impact facility. So David, please take the floor. I'm happy to hear your perspective and experience on investing into ASM Gold Mine.
Perfect. Thanks for moderating, Laura, and thanks to all the previous panelists. I think it's really good to see also these different perspectives. On the one hand, we have a governmental or quasi-governmental compliance perspective of why it is important that we need to care about professionalizing artisanal mining and trying to address these issues. Susan then spoke clearly to the environmental impacts through the Jeff Gold program, also that not engaging with the sector would have continued exposure to mercury and emissions here. And then Winifrida just very nicely showcased the developmental opportunity and potential that engaging constructively with ASM holds, and that can help change people's livelihoods and change a sector that counts 8 million people in total. So we could go to the next slide. We now look at this model that we've set up with the Impact Facility. And the Impact Facility is a non-profit registered in the UK, set up specifically to fill a gap that we identified, and that is investing into artisanal and small-scale mining and mining communities at large. What we describe as a cycle of poverty. And then Winifrida already said that if you do not have access to capital, you keep using rudimentary tools. which then restricts the amount of productivity and efficiency that you can achieve. As such, you generate low profits, and again, you don't have the funds necessary to break through here. And you can step in at various points in this cycle by introducing more efficient machines, by scaling business literacy. But our goal is to break this cycle of poverty and help artisanal miners pivot into small scale mining. So take up mechanization, step away from the most rudimentary tools, step away from the use of mercury, which is posing a huge risk not only to their own health, but the health of the communities around it, and also step into formal markets to address some of the issues that only occur after the gold has been extracted from the earth, because then we talk about money laundering, we talk about smuggling, we talk about linkages to drugs, and just a lot of informal businesses or sectors that very much appreciate that gold is a global currency, and as such seek to buy these metals as well. The picture you take here maybe has been taken in Tanzania and just showcases again that a big part of the workforce in the gold mining sector, ASM gold mining sector, is female. Estimates are 30 to 50%, depending on the operations. Most women find work above ground, and there's a great webinar on the same topic where we looked at gender specifically already recorded, and so we can link to that also at a later stage. But if you go to the Solidaridad website, you can watch that back. And lastly, before we go to the next slide, this quote here at the bottom, when I was discussing potential collaboration with one of the mines, they said, well, we're not looking for charity, we're sitting on gold, we just need somebody to help us get it out of the ground. And that's very true for gold, also for gemstones, another sector that is highly associated with artisanal mining. We talk about very valuable commodities where investments can boost profitability, and it doesn't need to be charity-led. We can find business solutions that can be mutually beneficial. We only need to establish a size and the infrastructure that makes that possible. And so that's really looking at how do we provide that initial access to finance. To the next slide, please. Now we've jumped many slides ahead. Perfect. We've already heard from Winifreda about the need for capacity building, and we've seen this also come back in the presentation of Susan. And a lot of organizations and a lot of initiatives are focused on building capacity. And here we talk about basically 3 streams of action. One is technical capacity, and that's something miners actively seek. That means better geological expertise, but also mining expertise. How can we build more stable tunnels? How can we get more gold out of the material that we are processing? So there's active demand for that. Secondly, we are looking at business literacy, something that, as Susan pointed out, many organizations are lacking. So we talk basic bookkeeping, basic understanding of profit and loss, where they're often tied up in existing finance agreements without understanding the actual interest or the actual return that they are paying, when those payments might be paid off. And that is to a large degree the result of a general lack of literacy. Many miners have not attended school, but that is it would be a broad generalization to say that miners haven't attended school. There's also very educated people that enter into these businesses, but can still benefit from a more structured approach to running a business. And so we really see small scale mining as a small and medium-sized enterprise. And that's how we should see it. They create jobs and they need these business skills. And then lastly, and that speaks to the points of Luis, there's a language around compliance that is very new to a lot of the miners, even though the international community associates them with issues around money laundering, around smuggling, around child labor. It's in their case, it's proving their innocence. And Susan also said that they might not have the means to communicate that they're already meeting these expectations of the market, because the majority of these 6 million miners, they're not criminals, they're not linked to any of the risks listed by the OECD. And so we need to show them how they can make that clear. And that's why capacity building is so important. But all the capacity building in the world can only go so far, because to pivot from using rudimentary tools, you need access to more advanced equipment. And that's why we have been trying out various different strategies for asset financing over the last few years, providing processing and some production equipment to miners in Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania, where we currently operate under what we call the Lake Victoria Gold Program, with the goal of boosting productivity, boosting recovery rates, and boosting the productivity of miners through a business model that works, and more to that on the upcoming slides. And then once we have that gold in hand, or the miners hold their gold in hand, what's the market that they can actually access? Because we do need a formal market to take off this material. In some places, and we'll get to that also on a subsequent slide, there can be a price incentive for miners to sell to you. In others, there's already fairly competitive prices in the informal market. But it is important that there is a formal market channel available. And in countries like Tanzania, we've seen the government take great initiative to formalize markets. There's state overseen buying centers with accredited buyers. In Kenya and Uganda, for example, that is not yet the case. But it's important that that formal avenue comes, because otherwise we start formalizing the businesses without allowing them a channel to sell their gold. And also we see an opportunity here to link offtake of the material to the support of the corporate sector. That definitely plays a role in supporting mines as well. And a quote that I loved from an interview in Kenya, where I was in a discussion. I was discussing an MOU for potential equipment, and one of the younger workers said, well, the pump here is much more expensive than the last pump we bought. Why do you want us to buy such an expensive pump? And then an older miner said, turned around to him and said, shut up, there's nothing more expensive than a cheap pump. Why is it we need a new pump now? So that was just nice to see. Really, some equipment might already be available, but we talk about appropriate technology, which speaks to the capacity of the miners, but also offers them the quality we need to maintain low maintenance costs and a long lifetime for what we're offering. And a lot of the readily available machines, which are very limited in scope, are unfortunately of often poor quality as well. If we could go to the next slide.
Hi, David, just a quick note that you have to...
Yeah, I'll speed up.
Okay, great.
So far, we were fairly blessed with being supported through a number of grants from the Dutch government, from Comic Relief, from the EPRM, that allowed us to set up programs in partnership with Solidaridad and other organizations. To date, we have established a network of more than 30 mine sites across these 3 countries in East Africa. We have developed the impact escalator framework that Winifrida showed, which has been run by potential investors and aligned with the OECD's expectations. And we were able to map out a route to market, so that we are currently in a stage where as soon as we access financing that allows us to provide these asset financing solutions to mines, we can really start thinking about how we channel then the gold from the mines to the international market as well. And very important, through these various iterations that we were able to do through grant financing, we now arrived at a business model that works for miners, and that from our perspective also should work for investors, where we invest and over time miners repay with interest, so that we can actually establish an economically self-sustaining model long term. On the next slide, you see an overview of the market size that we look at. And this is only looking at East Africa for now. High level estimates, because there's not a census necessarily of each and every mine site, but from what we understand and what we estimate, there's probably between 300 and 400 mining enterprises right now. Some have hundreds of workers, some might have a few dozen or less than 10, but there is a broad population of miners already working on this. The mine sites that we currently look at have at least 30 miners or workers on them, but some of them have even more than 500 workers. So again, a broad range. Some would be clearly categorized at small scale already. Others fit more into that poorly mechanized artisanal spectrum, but it is a spectrum. And as I said, the share of women is fairly high. Now, any one of these mines might be producing as little as 150 grams of gold a month. Some of them have even more than 2 kilos, but again, here we see a range. And by grouping them together in similar geographies, then we can think about a proposition of actually exporting it. But any one mine has too little gold to establish a direct link between a refiner and a mine, for example. And then if we look at mercury emissions, what does that mean? Usually a rule of thumb is that the amount of mercury being emitted is 1.5 times the amount of gold that we're looking at. And then that's represented here in the table as well. And now to the prices, and that's an important point, which we see in parallel to the investment opportunities. Some people really do not get the highest possible price yet, also because of the high transaction costs that traders are facing to reach the international market. But in other places, and that is specifically in Uganda, the 97% that we found, miners can get actually fairly high prices, which are also a result of operating with the informal market. Now, what would that mean? What could a sample investment look like? Here we see a quick portfolio that would roughly sum up to $50,000. So for a mine that is producing 1.5 kilos a month, that's equivalent to less than a month production in terms of revenue. Investing in water pumps, generators, compressors, and jaw crushers is really a game changer when we look at production. Water pumps, as Winnie said, can help bridge the raining season and extend health and safety, but also productivity a lot. Generators help reduce emissions, just diesel emissions, depending on what generator we're looking at, but also boost productivity. And the same goes for a compressor that replaces a hammer and a chisel in some cases with much more potent equipment. And then on the right side, we see some processing equipment here, gravimetric solutions that can replace or reduce the need for mercury, which again can help increase the recovery. So how much gold is actually being extracted from the ore that has already been produced. And so with a investment of $50,000 that could be repaid within 2 to 3 years, or here, you have a time of 2 years indicated, you can really double the production at these mine sites and significantly increase profit margins as well. On the next slide then, let's talk about what we see and what the opportunity is that we are so excited to share with you. As of right now, we have scoped out 12 to 15 mine sites that are ready or close to ready to receiving investment from us. Right now, we're looking at just an immediate deployment of somewhere around $500,000. So not huge numbers in the terms of the investment world, but really game changers for the mines on the ground. The average investment here would be between $25,000 and $35,000, similar to what I just went through with this 50,000 investment case. And miners are usually asking for repayment periods of 1.5 to 3 years, with various payment breaks and grace periods calculated in that. Generally, we expect from miners a down payment of 10%, and then that really shows then that people are ready to do business and are also willing to repay, and it shows the first just dedication to also future repayments. But after that, we understand you need a grace period to actually utilize the machines to learn how to best use them. And sometimes things happen that you didn't see coming. So in the contracts that we have in place at the moment, there are payment breaks that up to twice a year people can ask for pausing their payment because rains might have been harder than expected. Maybe there was a fatality that they needed to take care of and then support the family with, or some other issue that they didn't see coming. And so we really tried to come up with terms that work for miners. And this is a lease to purchase proposition where ourselves, we're then charging 15 to 20% interest to the miners, which is the equivalent of the going rates. So in Kenya, we currently have a rate of 15% on loans. And in Uganda, it is 19% interest that are being charged. And this comes with the benefits of service and maintenance guarantees from our side as well. And super excited, and that's why Tom is also on the call today. The Genesis Trust is an organization that has seen the potential of ASM as a livelihood driver and is willing to put up $400,000 to support the OPEX and the scaling of our program if we are able to secure a matching amount of financing, which are the $350,000 to $400,000 that we are aiming for. So from an investor perspective, hopefully that shows some stability in terms of the costs that we will encounter. We can currently still cover through grant financing, taking a blended finance approach. Moving forward, and once we scale, and that's displayed on the next slide, we hoped, or on the slide after that, but we hope to achieve maturity and then something self-financing. And so by 2020, we are aiming to recruit 2 million in financing. And by the year 2024, our goal is to have a revolving fund of 5 million in size. If you could go back one more slide, because that is important when we talk about impact investing. What is it that we can actually then change for the miners? I think throughout the presentations, we already touched on a lot of these things, but we believe we can boost production at the mine sites and as such profitability and income, not only for the owners, but also for the workers. That's something that we are really adamant about. We put in place measures to reduce mercury. Here we state not 100% reduction or elimination, but a goal of 90% reduction per mine site, which would indicate that at least mercury is being managed through the use of retorts and other measures that can be taken. And then the jobs that are associated with that, making sure that people feel safe at work. If we now look at that initial investment of 350 to 500,000, we believe that can impact between 1,500 and 2,000 workers. And now one last thought as we go to the next slide before handing over to Tom. Why do we do this? Why do we need blended finance to begin with? And there's a great paper written by my colleagues on this that has been published by Jeff Gold in collaboration with Susan here. For the sector to mature and to go from informality to formality, we need to go through a transition. And this is something that isn't completely hypothetical, but something that we've seen in agriculture, something that we've seen in general microfinancing as well, where it starts with local lending, often as extortionate rates, as people describe it, but in the absence of any risk information, reward needs, high risk needs to be balanced with high reward. We can try to step in here through programmatic investing, and that's what we've done over the last 3 years. We were able to utilize grants to address the use of mercury, to address women empowerment through grants that allowed us to actually pilot investments and see what is the business case here, how do we need to structure this as we turn this into a commercial proposition. And now we are here at this transition of step 2 to step 3, where we are actively trying to recruit impact financing through a blended finance model, where we can repay investors, but there's still a high risk that there will be learnings along the way. But in this period now, we are able to leverage both grant financing and investment finance to build up a proposition that hopefully then will be taken up by local financial institutions and commercial financial institutions in that stage 4, where suddenly the wider financing industry sees the potential of ASM as an investable sector. And with this, I'd love to hand over to Tom, who is representing Genesis Trust and who has this offer on the table to provide the OPEX grant that I mentioned.
Thanks, David. Yes, I manage Genesis Charitable Trust, which is a corporate foundation inside Genesis Emerging Markets Investment Fund in London. It feels like a long time ago that we were in Gaeta, northern Tanzania, and then on to OECD for the ASM conference in Paris. But yeah, so you say this offer is certainly on the table. David and Winifred have spoken to the detail of the program Genesis is most closely involved in East Africa and Tanzania. And time is short, so I won't rehearse the detail there. But I suppose I'm making a plea and an offer to my fellow grant makers and social investors to look at ASM and not to pocket the headline risk that Susan outlined. And I think we all know really that life in mining is nasty, brutish and short, but it doesn't have to be that way. And these solutions are in a complex setting, they are unproven, it's challenging, it is high risk. But just urging my fellow funders not to look away, because if we looked away for every sector, we wouldn't have done anything in microfinancing where there was loan sharks, we wouldn't have done anything in fisheries or plastics, we wouldn't touch pesticides and fertilizers, and therefore we wouldn't do anything in farming. So I'd say this is a kind of new frontier, this is a new area where social and impact investors need to look. I think that set of slides really sets out what we're really intending to do. Hopefully Genesis is part of that de-risking effort for other funders to follow. We wanted to focus most on OPEX so that the finance was coming from others, because what we really felt was what had been done before by philanthropists and by the NGOs was necessary, valuable, but not sufficient. And we really need to build these recycling financial models and facilities that are devolved locally to miners. And so, yeah, we're on the OPEX side. We need you guys to follow in with the capital. And I guess the offer is that we'll open our books. If you knock on our door, we'll share our due diligence. We can show the track record we have so far. Yeah, that's an invitation. Please take us up on it.
Thanks a lot for your addition, Tom, and so that's absolutely fantastic, your offer, and I think it actually provides a very nice bridge to our last panelist, but very definitely not least panelist, who can actually talk a bit more about impact investing in agriculture and the lessons learned there, which ties in very well with what Tom just mentioned. We have more experience there, so let's take those lessons into another sector as well. So Ebenezer, would love to invite you to share your experience and knowledge in that field. After that, we'll open to questions. So until 5:30, we have enough space for discussion. So Ebenezer, thank you very much to share your experience.
Thank you very much, Laura. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone who's made time to join us. I will be sharing with you some insights and strategies that we have gained and adopting by investing in smallholders in the climate smart agri sector, which we think can be transferred to the small scale mining sector. In the agri sector, the small scale smallholders we are looking at are within the poultry and the oil palm industries. Next slide. So Wangara
Hi, Ebenezer, I think you just froze. Can you maybe please check your connection? Let me check if I can do something from here. Hi, I think Ebenezer will try to reconnect. Let's see, wait for a minute if he can actually reconnect, and otherwise I'll already do some questions in between. As there were quite some questions in the Q&A box. Let's see. Hi, Ebenezer, can you try again to speak?
Yes, thank you, Laura. I think I was thrown out. We can go to the next slide. In the climate smart agri sector, I was first to talk about the investment in the poultry smallholder space. With the effect of climate change in Africa, there are some sectors that are feeling the pinch. Not much is said about them. If you take the poultry industry, for example, increasing temperatures means that their yield from their poultry is reducing. That means that they need better feed. The smallholders do not typically produce their own feed, and they don't have if I'll say enough funding to purchase all the feed that they require. So this company called Aquaba Feed decided to address that challenge by producing feed that was at the right price point. And to do this, they were being innovative by using insect protein, which in itself has a lower carbon footprint, to make sure that the efficacy of the feed was higher, and the smallholders could access it as a good price point. We looked at this company to invest, and we had a few challenges. The main challenge was that this was a company 2 years old, and they came across as not investment ready. Typically, most investors will walk away from a deal like this. But we, because of how we have been structured and set up, were able to look at this investment, and we brought in our partner InnoHub, which gave them some investment readiness that addressed some of our perceived risks. So we had challenges about the size of the market. They were able to help them with the proper market study and help validate the market and develop a go-to-market strategy. We had challenges about the business plan. They wanted to expand their production plant. They were able to come in and help with the strategic planning. Following our investment in them, they're also helping them with the business formalization, setting up the board, having the right manuals and financial processes in place. One other element where we had a bit of a challenge was the technical side, because this was a poultry feed company that was looking at using insect protein. That's got a circular economy impact where you have the black soldier fly, used the food waste from both the poultry production and restaurants to produce the protein, but it was not their technical expertise. So we were able to work with them to bring in a startup that specializes in this called the West Africa feed. And part of our investment in Aquaba feed was allocated to this company, the startup, to help them improve and expand their own production, with Aquaba being the off-taker. The idea is for West Africa feeds to grow and then go beyond Aquaba feed in terms of who they are selling their insect protein to. The ultimate beneficiary is the smallholder poultry farmer who now has the feed that can help them get better yield to combat the issues they are facing with climate change. We can go to the next slide, and I will speak about the smallholders in the oil palm industry. The oil palm industry, as we all know, very much like mining, has received a lot of flack for climate change. But the reality on the ground is these are livelihoods, and these are industries that are going to be with us for a very long time. And it's in our best interest to make sure that we improve them and make them more climate friendly. In this space, we looked at a few investments, but we found them also not to be investment ready, even though they had received a lot of, if I would say, support from Solidaridad and other NGOs. And to address this, what we've been able to do is to look at what had been done by Solidaridad in terms of the swap program they've been running. This is the Sustainable West Africa Oil Palm Program. And to look at the franchise model they had developed for regional services centers. And these regional services centers really kind of bridge the gap between the smallholder and the investor. And they essentially provide key services to these smallholders. So what we are doing is providing loans which are concessional. So these loans are not coming from our own balance sheet, because our IC would not pass this investment at this stage because of the investment readiness. But with the concessional loans which are coming from Acmea Foundation, we are able to deploy this capital on commercial terms and have a good proof of concept to be able to do follow-on investments. This allows these regional services centers first to have the asset financing they require and the working capital. The way they operate is that they have a franchise model. And this is very key because the franchise model itself is supported by a company called West Africa Agribusiness Solution. And they provide these regional services centers, which in themselves are new companies. And some of them have been around, but really now developing this model and improving the business case to have the kind of capacity building support they need, both from a management and a technical point of view. So if you take one company, for example, called NAK, you have West Africa Agribusiness providing financial management. That gives us as an investor some comfort to go ahead with them. Now, these regional services centers are able to provide farm management services to the smallholder oil palm and producers, as well as inputs on credit until it's time for harvest. And when it's harvest, they then help them aggregate and find markets through negotiating better prices with the millers. And these are services that they are able to provide because of the franchise model and the funding that we through Acmea Foundation and Solidaridad are providing them. We can go to the next slide. I would say that from these two examples, we filter it down to three, if I say insights or tactics or we think can be adopted in the small scale mining sector. And this first one is the value chain development approach. In looking at the smallholders and in looking at these small scale miners, sometimes you need to look within the value chain to see where the best intervention could be provided. Where in our case, in the poultry, we funded a feed provider. In the case of the oil palm, we funded a new social enterprise, which is the regional service center. They are then able to deploy the right kind of support to the smallholders. So for example, the best management practices to make the farming practices more climate friendly. They can also provide these with a better credit facility in terms of if they were to provide them in the case of the oil palm, the inputs are on credit until harvest time, right? Whereas we may not have been able to give these smallholders loans directly. They are also then able to provide certain equipment leasing in the case of mining, where we've heard a lot about the need for this equipment. And most importantly, also help aggregate, provide market access and get them fair prices, right? The second element is that of the investment readiness support. A lot of these investments are short of reaching their goals because the perceived risk is quite high, and some level of support is able to address that. So these involve the business formalization, the strategic planning. And I would like to mention particularly the team capacity building and in some cases augmentation, right? Where it then helps them grow the business and get to a point where they are more investable. And last but not the least is the kind of capital, because usually commercial impact investors like ourselves would want to see some proof of concept, see the de-risking. And this is where we need to start thinking about how do we shift from the typical grant to packaging these using blended finance to still have the properties of your typical investment to prove that these are investable and they can really use this capital and pay back, right? And that is a very important key to catalyzing private capital in the long term. But before we get there, we need this kind of concessional blended finance to prove that concept and give that kind of comfort. I would end by saying that some sectors receive a lot of flack, but next slide. But if you look at Africa, for example, we have a situation whereby for the next 10 years, we have about 10 million youth entering the job market. And we need to provide jobs for them. Agri is a key sector, and so is the mining industry. And it's very important that we improve these sectors, professionalize and formalize them, so that their capacity to absorb a lot of these youth who will be joining the workforce is enhanced. And it's very important, especially given that some sectors are already facing the challenges from climate change. If you take agri, like I said, poultry farmers, which many people don't talk about, are suffering and their livelihood is being impacted. If they don't find poultry farming being sustainable, they might just join what we call in Ghana galamsey, which is illegal mining and very disorganized versus small-scale mining. So we need to address this, but we cannot do this in silos, and we need a collaborative effort to make sure we have the right solutions to solve these. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Ebenezer, and also ending on that note, striking the similarities between ASM mining and agriculture, and also how important it is in light of climate change, not only for job provision, but also for the material provision, I would say, for our transition to technologies. We're going to rely on it as well. So thank you very much, Ebenezer. That was really insightful. So in the meantime, there are quite some questions coming in. Please keep them going. We have until 5:30, so I'll try to address most of them. My first question that I would like to ask is to Louis from the OECD. There was a question asked by Wilson Owala on how do you connect local with international buyers by gold? And I would like to extend that question a little bit with also your vision or the OECD's vision on what the role not only of the impact investor or financial sector is, but also of the corporate sector in driving these changes or potential investments in ASM.
Thank you. It's a very broad question. I mean, one question is how you connect, ASGM with international buyers. The second, and perhaps more challenging, is how do you do this in a responsible way? I mean, you can find tons of buyers of gold all across the world. What we're trying to do is make sure that the production and trade takes place in a responsible way. So coming back to what I was saying, this involves a lot of intermediation with, in particular, downstream buyers of gold that want to understand the extent of the legal risk they might be taking, what is the business model, does engaging with ASM make commercial sense, and what kind of profit they can take out of this operation. So at the moment, since this is still very nascent, establishing those sustainable and responsible supply chains of ASM gold, it involves a lot of bilateral conversations, as I was saying. We've done quite a lot of progress in terms of raising the awareness, making sure that international buyers understand the extent of their responsibility, why it makes sense for them to engage with the artisanal and small-scale mining sector. So I think there is a broad understanding now of the why you should engage with artisanal miners. The real challenging aspect now is how do you do this in a commercial, in a way that makes commercial sense, and that's much more challenging. So what we're trying to do is identify the various projects around the world trying to support responsible production of ASGM. And whenever we find one of those, such as the Impact Facility, for instance, we make all the efforts that we can to connect them, if they need us, to potential buyers internationally. And then we spend quite a lot of time clarifying some misconceptions with international buyers of gold. And that takes quite a lot of efforts. And I think that comes to your question, Nora, what's the role of corporate sector? I mean, they definitely have a key role to play because we need those responsible downstream actors to take their own risks if they really want to be part of the solution. We're at the moment are actively fighting what we call de-risking strategies, whereby we see international buyers boycotting gold from Africa or boycotting gold from the artisanal sector just because they want to avoid risks. They want to limit their exposure to risk. This is risk avoidance, and that does not fall in line with the expectations of our standard and our initiative.
Thanks a lot, Louis. That's I think it will. I also have a question to Susan related to that. In your research on barriers to finance, you've looked at different financial models and also historically of what has been tried and tested in terms of investment and also technology transfer, etc. Can you tell us a bit about what models have worked and hasn't worked, and maybe also in a nutshell, if you see that environment around it changing for the benefit or for the worse. But yeah, it would be great if you could share some of your knowledge on that and insights.
I think
So,
as a whole, sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, Lee.
Go ahead, Louis.
Oh, sorry. That's a very interesting question. Just wanted to say that in general, we see a big shift in the attitude of the corporate sector towards ASM. It's been driven in part by the conversation around responsible sourcing of cobalt, but that in gold it still remains extremely challenging. Sorry, Susan, for cutting you off here. I'm sign it now.
I think Susan will probably mainly talk about the investment sector. So great addition, Louis. Thanks. Go ahead, Susan.
Yeah, well, they're not unconnected, the investment and the corporate sector. But in any case, yeah, your question about our review of the literature, I would encourage everyone to go to planetgold.org and look at the actual reports for all the details. In a nutshell, I mean, there have been a lot of attempts, especially by donor organizations, philanthropic organizations, and sometimes working with commercial finance to try to develop different kinds of loan facilities. That's very common. There's been different attempts at microfinance directed at ASM, and also mining ministries creating revolving funds that are directed specifically for small-scale miners. There's variants on that, but those are kind of the basic things that have been tried. I would say that the results have not been great, which is why I guess we're still here today, trying to figure out how to actually finance the sector. And the reason being, well, there's a lot of reasons. Some of the barriers I've already discussed, but I think a lot of those attempts, kind of tackled one piece of the pie. They looked at providing technology, for example, or maybe formalization or something, but they didn't really look at this holistic environment that needs to be created, as we've been discussing. The miners don't just need a pump, they actually also need business training, and they need to understand what it means to take a loan. And I mean, they do understand, but what terms are they actually signing up for? And all of that is has to work together. Also, there more information. I mean, this is a very often obscure sector. People don't really have a good sense of the risks. And so, they do require very high returns, which has been a big problem, and also one of the sources of some of the less than successful applications. Just not being able to evaluate the portfolio properly and really taking unknown risks. And in those cases, those for example, revolving funds didn't succeed because they couldn't get a sufficient repayment rate because they hadn't evaluated their lendees well enough. So there's lots of reasons for why they haven't worked. So that, but that's the history. How can we move forward? And that's what we've been talking about today. How can we really use the blended finance to help with creating these successful models, really taking into account the entire ecosystem, not just here's a pump or but actually, what is the entire need for professionalization of the sector and professionalization of these businesses, so that then they just are regular small-scale enterprises, like other small-scale enterprises that have the normal access to commercial finance and investment. Why am I hopeful at all that things have changed? Well, Louis is not wrong in saying that the atmosphere has really shifted about just kind of the general perceptions around small-scale mining have changed, partially because of the OECD dialogue, whether it was specifically about cobalt. I may be more optimistic than he is about gold. I think there's also been a lot of discussion around gold and a lot more attention paid to the economic potential of the sector, its ability to really meet a lot of the SDGs. I think that's attracted donors and also governments to really try to consider this sector. As Ebenezer said, climate change is coming. Lots more people are going to mining as agriculture fails, and so they really do need to figure out how to address this sector. It's not going to go away anytime soon. I think I'll also just put in a pitch for the Minamata Convention on Mercury. It is a Mercury convention. Maybe Mercury isn't the very most biggest problem of the small scale gold mining sector, but nonetheless, it offers an entry point. It is to my knowledge, the only international law that requires parties to address and improve the sector. And those, parties now have an obligation under international law to do something about this sector. It's not just kind of the flavor of the month. This is something they've signed up to. There are financial resources to go along with that commitment, as the Planet Gold program shows. Currently we are a $45 million program. They've just committed another, I don't want to say the exact number, I've forgotten, maybe 50, another 50 million to the program to work worldwide. And that's leveraging, also lots of other sources of finance as well. So I think there's a lot more energy, a lot more attention, a lot more knowledge, a lot more, it's less mysterious of a sector than it used to be. And so through that, we're hoping to, obviously one of the goals of Planet Gold is this communication, knowledge sharing that will further educate, and then through education de-risk and demystify the sector and thereby attract finance.
Yeah, so in general, there's a growing support in terms of government action and concerted efforts from multiple stakeholders to actually really try to make this happen over the coming years, which is indeed something to be optimistic about. There are quite some questions. You maybe just heard me take a screenshot because we cannot answer all, so we'll try to do that later by email. I wanted to ask two more questions. One to Winnie. There was a question on the formalization process, and that usually the introduction of technology tends to exclude women from that process, which is kind of a negative side effect. How do you work locally to ensure that the position of women is still remains intact and empowered?
Thank you for the good question. For Solidaridad, we build capacity to ASM miners based on the international standard, as you have seen in the ESG escalator. And it is among the requirements for example, in fair trade gold standards that the mine should support women. And this is among the compliance. So with these standards, now we stress on supporting women for the mines. But also we do a lot of advocacy to the mines for women to have opportunities to engage in leadership, but also to earn more income, to be valued, to be supported with different stakeholders, not only miners, but also even the government, to be included in the budget. So we have done a number of projects in women in ASM, and we have seen a lot of support and improvement. For example, we had one project where we engaged 15 mines to support women in leadership, and then we saw that among the 15 mines, in 14 we had women in leadership by the end of the project. So that was the great achievement which we had. Yeah, that's how we work. And with these miners, as they comply with this requirement, now we term that they have reached a certain level of advancement in ESG escalator.
Maybe one more question, because I think you can probably quickly answer that. From Laifodi, that's the experience in South African region when dealing with artisanal miners is that there's often a lack of access to geological data and surveys and tools to know exactly where to dig, which is, as we know, also quite an important factor to, one, preserve the environment, but on the other hand, also get access to finance or collateral, because you can better estimate the production capacity. What is your experience with that? And is there anything that Solidaridad is currently undertaking to, in that respect?
Geological data to ASM miners has been the challenge. And with lack of geological data, we see that they have been disturbing the mining land. And also they have been distorting the environment because they rely on colonial pits. So, and they do not know the estimated reserve for mining. So Solidaridad is currently going to have a project on geological data to do a research and see the miners' needs for geological data, and also to try to find the geological information which have been developed by the government, and see the possibilities for this data to be accessible by ASM.
Yeah. Great, Winnie. So maybe the person who asked the question can connect with you later on this topic. Thanks, Winnie. We almost have to close. We have 4 minutes left. So my last question would now go to David, I suppose, because there was a question on, let me see. You talked about the different financing stages of first having more programmatic finance, then going to impact investment, and afterwards having the more commercial finance stepping in. Can you tell a bit more in what stage you currently are, was the question? And maybe also how you're, would envision bridging then eventually also to the commercial financing space.
Great. So we started investing 4 years ago through various grant financing projects, and so that very much fits exclusively into that second bracket or second stage that we've seen, programmatic investing. Here there was a big focus on both mercury reduction and gender, with various interventions to help address these issues, and it allowed us to pilot and trial different repayment modes and different options, but it was very much grant-driven, trying to establish a means of engagement and scoping out the market. So as a result of that, now we have 30 mines, 12 of which are have saved up money or are saving up money for their down payment, and they're waiting to receive financing. And so before we can roll out additional investments, and to date, 10 mines have benefited from investment from us, and we have still 5 active repayments of these, but there's another 12 mines that are now ready to receive financing, but we haven't yet secured the capital to do so. Once we do, we fall back on Tom's offer, as long as that's still on the table, that we can access additional grant financing that allows us to further scope out and onboard more mines. And really the ambition here is, based on everything that we've learned to date, growing this to a portfolio of roughly 4 to 5 million over the next 4 years, at which we should be able to run and facilitate the fund self-sustaining, still doing projects in partnership with Solidaridad and others, but no longer relying heavily on grant financing to subsidize cost. But in order to get to this fund size of 4 million, we do need to make the transition. So from our perspective, I wouldn't say that that's then still a fully commercial proposition, but we hope to be on the verge of the 3rd to the 4th stage in now 3 years' time. But really, the 4th stage will only be reached when local banks are confident in investing into ASM sites as well. And here we are already in discussions to see how can we even play a bridging role to provide risk data based on pilot investments with us, so that in the future we might be the ones de-risking engagement with a specific mine, and then a commercial actor is stepping in after and continuing maybe with a bigger loan based on the repayment history that we were able to establish with the mines.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot, David. I have a lot more nice questions to answer, so we ran a bit out of time. Yeah, we're really out of time. So thank you, everyone, all the panelists. Really thank you for great contributions. It was a really interesting, different angles and perspectives on the same topic. I think we're pretty aligned that investments would be a next step in the ASM sector, and that we really going to try how to get there. So this was the 5th webinar. After the webinar, we'll circulate all the slides where also contact details are in if you would like to continue the discussion directly. For now, really thank you all for your attendance, and I hope you enjoyed the webinar, and you'll have the slides soon, and have a really nice evening, afternoon, end of the morning to everyone. So thank you very much. Bye.